name is Marcia Karp.
Really?
Yes. And
it's only Marcia Karp, nothing else?
That's it. That's it. Yeah. And my mother was from, parents were from Russia. My father's parents were from Poland.
Ah. Where are we, Marcia?
Well, we're in London. We're at my house. It's July 2017. And I'm thinking back about such lovely memories that we're talking about your being with Zerka for the last time. And it makes me happy to think of you so many times with her, filming her, and giving us your unique interpretation via your video, which reminds me about the conserve that Moreno used to tell us that we should use it as a resource.
Mm-hmm.
I remember in training thinking that the conserve was a dirty word because when we went into the theater, for example, our cameras didn't work. If we wanted to take a photograph, our cameras didn't work. If we wanted to do a tape recording, the tape recording didn't work. I remember all of us being shocked at this strange situation. Of course, for them, the filming, they did filming there. There was a cine camera that used to film sessions and stuff. But it was never used during the time that I was there. But it sat up there, and I remember this sense that Moreno told us music in the session. We should have everybody make their own music. Don't use music from someplace else.
Mm-hmm.
Or don't use words or scripts from prior sessions. Always, invent it as we were going.
You are from the United States.
I am from the United States, yes. How am I here?
Yeah.
I fell in love with a Brit, and a friend of mine wrote a book about how do people go to another country, and it's usually because they fall in love with somebody and come on that basis.
And that was the case?
That was the case, yes.
And who was it?
He was Ken Sprague. My brother met him in Mexico, and then I met him in London. So when I was coming to London, my brother suggested that I meet him, and I met him.
And when was it?
It was 1971.
So basically love brought you here.
Love brought me here. And love brought me to Psychodrama, as a matter of fact. Also.
How?
Curiosity. Well, two ways. One was I was studying at the University of Wisconsin, and I loved my work. I was studying speech pathology, speech therapy. And when I was studying for my final exam, as happens most of us, we read everything we're not supposed to read. And I found a book above my head that was called Psychodrama. Morenos, I think it was volume 1. And he wrote a little bit about working with stammerers, people who stutter.
Yes.
And I was working with stammerers, and I thought, oh, how interesting. If you could get them to play the role of someone else, they can establish fluency. So I asked my professor, could I try what this Moreno man said? And he said, yes, of course, try. And so I got a young boy to role reverse with his grandmother, who would say, get off the grass, very fast and very authoritarian. And he could establish fluency so easily, just like that. And they shocked themselves, I shocked myself, and then I began reading about actors and singers who can sing and act on stage in a perfect rhythm, but then come off the stage and say, how was it? Like that.
Yeah.
So I began to think, oh my goodness, we have many roles inside us. We have many parts of us that can be taken. And then I thought, how could that part, his authoritarian aunt, be part of himself? Because it wasn't enough just to have fluency, but how could he use that authority that he's unable to use? So that became my work. Then the more I began to read about it and be interested in it, the more I thought I better find this study that I want. And I applied for an MA degree in New York at Columbia. And
what is it, May? MA?
A master's program.
Ah, yeah, okay.
In speech therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I chose New York was so I would be near Morenos' center and ideas and to study with him. It was twofold.
Mm-hmm.
But what drew me was the fact that Moreno was in New York.
And how was the first encounter with him? Do you remember?
I do. The first encounter was on the telephone. A friend of mine, Jim Sachs, who I had met at the Moreno Institute when he was directing, was speaking on the telephone to him, and I heard his voice, and I thought, what a strong voice, a happy voice, Viennese, full-bodied voice, and I thought, oh, this is Moreno that I've been reading about and hearing about and so on. And then that night or the next night, he took me to see Moreno, Rogers, Pearls, Albert Ellis in New York, and they each had, you remember the film Gloria that they did, everybody had 20 minutes with a patient? Well, each of them had a period of time with a patient. And then the patient talked about, when I was with Carl Rogers I felt this, or when I was with Moreno I felt that. And so there was a discussion. That was the first time I saw Moreno, amongst other clinicians, to see the use of the drama. And then I watched Jim direct a few times, and then I saw Doctor Moreno direct, and I must have been about 21. Zerka, the early part of the evening, Zerka would see patients at the Moreno Institute. It was a patient group she saw, and we were as students playing auxiliary roles in that group. And then later in the evening at 8 o'clock, Moreno would run the big public session in 78th and Broadway in New York.
But at that time, you were sleeping at the institute or going every day? How was it?
No, at first I went, the first time was a visit, and then they drove us. There were so few students that they drove us from New York City to Beacon, which was an hour and 10 minutes, hour and 15 minutes. And then we would sleep there, but we would only be in New York on the Friday evening to see his work and her work. But normally we were sleeping at the Moreno Academy.
Which year we are talking about?
This would have been 1965.
65. Moreno was still very active.
Very active. He was in his 70s. Our main work was with Zerka in the theater, in the day. In the evening we would go down to the house, which was, I don't know, a 3-minute walk from the place where we stayed. And he would hold forth. I mean, it was like a seminar with him. He didn't know what went on in the day, and he would just ask us, who directed? Oh, you directed. Then he would say, who was the protagonist? What was she like as a director? Who played auxiliary roles? Did you have any questions when you were playing her mother? um, w- when did you direct a role reversal? Moreno would say, and do you know what is a role reversal? Somebody discussed why do we role reverse. Somebody would begin to answer the question, and then he would give a talk on role reversal, or who used a double and why was a double used and how was it used, and then he would give a long talk about why he established the double, which was interesting. I've never seen it written about, but he talked about Guy de Maupassant, the writer. There was an article, I think, in the New York Times or one of the papers written about Guy de Maupassant having a breakdown where he came away from the desk and he saw himself separate from himself. And Moreno thought, I wonder if we could use that person to be alongside himself or herself in order for the person to gain control of their own madness. So the person would be able to say, no, I don't agree with that idea, or yes, I agree with that idea, or that's not what I feel. If the person heard voices, that's not what I think, that's not what I... So establishing the double for the use with psychotics was based on his observation of the madness of Guy de Maupassant. Then Zerka, those years later, I remember her saying very proudly, you know, I use the double less and less as I get older.
Yeah.
Because I think the quintessence of directing is getting the information and the feelings and the thoughts from the protagonist. Even though she was such a superb double, she used it less and less. And she also taught us that as the director, you should be doubling in your head all the time, so that you can check with your protagonist, do I get this right? The feeling toward your father is one of great ambivalence or anger or love or whatever it is, or to affirm what it is she is doubling in her own mind. But when you were talking about Zerka and her life and her interpretation of different scenes in her book, To Dream Again, I remember my first impression of her was how beautiful she was. I didn't register that she didn't have an arm. I just didn't, it was just how beautiful she was. And she said something so important the first time. She said, I had said the protagonist's mother had to scrub the floor all the time, and she said, oh, washing floors, that's never been an interest of mine. Or, oh, I don't know why a woman would have to wash the floor, or something like that. And I came from a household where my mother did wash the floor, and had to wash the floor. And I thought, oh, you mean there's a different model of a woman? Is there a different model of a woman who doesn't have to be chained to the kitchen? I just didn't understand there was another way to be. So that was so interesting.
There is something that when we were talking about the evenings when Doctor used to talk with the students, people at their small house, I was thinking about something regarding processing. Do you think that it was already the processing,
Definitely.
the fourth part of it?
Definitely.
And on this, from my experience, I can see that many times when do psychodrama, we stop at the sharing, and we do not necessarily do processing, because what he said, and I heard several people talking about that processing is only when we are talking with people who are being trained
To direct.
to direct. I'd like to to get your views on that, because if we look at education as a permanent process and the need to keep learning, keep being aware and improving more and more and advancing our knowledge, not only from an intellectual point of view, but from an existential point of view, why not include the processing as a permanent fourth step, fourth part of the process?
Well, we did that. We had a residential center, and some of the people in our group were patients and some were professionals.
Mm-hmm.
And we would say to the protagonist, because the processing was often in the evening, you have the privilege, the opportunity to stay or go if you want to, whoever it was.
Mm-hmm.
Most people stayed, almost everybody stayed. Over 30 years, rarely did anybody not stay for the processing. And very often, people would say, I learned more from the processing than I did from the session. I learned about myself, even as the protagonist. I learned about myself as you're all talking about what was done, what could be done, what should have been done. Though we think it's just for the director, in fact, people who play roles get a chance to understand what happened to you playing that role, which was a question Moreno used to ask us. When you were being her mother, what happened to you? What was your experience of it? How was it different or like or whatever, your own life experience?
Yeah, no, I was going to say something else regarding the processing. That what happens is that sometimes, because, let's say, the protagonist and also the auxiliary egos, people who are directly participating in the action and are so emotionally moved, it's not always evident that immediately after the sharing they would be in a position to talk about it. So that's why sometimes we can defer the processing, and instead of doing immediately, for instance, doing the day after, or depending on the frequency, the week after.
And there's even somebody in Italy who will do it, let's say, a month later, 3 weeks later, when the director gets a video of their directing, and they get a chance to look at it and discuss it and come back to the group. So if it's a training group, they get a chance to digest that for a period of time. At Holwell, we would do that either the day before, the day after, the session would be the day before, or we would have dinner after the session, and then a break of a few hours, and then have an evening session from 8 o'clock onwards.
Okay, well,
But it wasn't for the protagonists to say anything. They didn't have a chance, they didn't need to say anything. And they were given that option, that they could just listen. So there wasn't any questioning of how are you now, or what was the most help to you, because Moreno called it a psychodramatic shock. Very often patients have, or people, protagonists, all of us, have a shock of our own reality, surplus reality, realizations, and so on. So it isn't always necessary for the protagonist to take part in it.
Immediately, at least.